Last week we spoke about chesed. And we could speak about chesed for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, but that's obviously not the goal. The goal is to try and get through the various spheros. So, what we didn't do last week, really, is we didn't talk about chesed in the context of creation, in the context of Hashem's energy. We spoke primarily about chesed in our own experience. We spoke about certain personalities in history that illustrate healthy chesed, like Avraham, and unhealthy chesed, like Yishmael. But we didn't really speak about chesed in Hashem's terms. So, the minute you say that Hashem is going to express chesed, you naturally assume that that's a very positive thing. Obviously, what else would we want? Surely we would want Hashem's kindness in our lives. Surely. And we say that. We say things like, Zechor rachamecha v'chasadecha. Hashem, remember your compassion and your kindness. We speak about the idea that olam chesed yiboneh, that the world was created out of kindness, etc., etc. So there's so many references that we use where we want to refer to Hashem's kindness. But one of the things that we learned last week is kindness can be a little bit much. Kindness can become overbearing. Kindness can be smothering. Right? We learned those things. So, for example, we talk about the sun as a symbol of chesed, because without the sun we wouldn't be able to survive. And yet, at the same time, the sun has to be calibrated, otherwise too much sun is going to be too much for us. Forget about, getting too close to the sun. We know that there are various planets that are too close to the sun, they cannot survive, or they cannot incubate, life, sustainable life. Forget about that. You look out the window, you can't even look at the sun because it's too intense. And that is only a metaphor for chesed. So can you imagine if Hashem had to really expose his chesed, his unlimited, unmitigated energy into the world? We would never handle it. It's not even possible. It's not possible. So what does the Torah tell us? The Torah tells us that when Hashem created the world, what was the first thing he created? Light. First thing he created was light. And light is very, very often associated with the concept of chesed. And for very obvious reason. If you're in a place that you don't know well, and it's dark, the chances are you're going to hurt yourself. And then if somebody walks in and they turn on the light, so you don't now have to bump your way through the furniture, they turn on the light, you could say that was a chesed. Because they've now made life clearer and easier and safer. So there's a direct association between light and chesed. And yet, one of the things that we know that the Midrash tells us is the original light that Hashem used in creation, he hid. Why? Because it's too intense. It's too powerful. It's too overwhelming. And we cannot handle it. We cannot expose ourselves to that kind of light. So when we speak about Hashem's chesed, the reality is that we are unable to experience Hashem's chesed. That's the truth. We're unable to experience Hashem's chesed. I'll give you a little example of this. It's a bit of a trick question, but it will illustrate the point really well. So when are you able to look at sunlight?
As it's being from the...
Okay, so sunrise, sunset, right? That's when you're able to look at sunrise. At sunlight. Why is it? How come you can look at the sun then? It's not fully expressed yet, right? It's still rising or it's setting or whatever the case is. So when else can you look at sunlight? Besides that, that's obvious, right? When else? When you look at the moon. Because there's no such thing as moonlight, as much as we say that it's moonlight. I remember when I first installed our solar system at home, so like everybody else, when you put in your solar system, you're very obsessed with tracking, for like the first 24 hours, you're very obsessed with how much are you generating, how much energy, this and that, whatever. So it was a full moon, and I saw on the app that we were still getting 1% solar energy at night. Because at the end of the day, there is no such thing as moonlight. Moonlight is sunlight. Moonlight is sunlight that is not too intense for us to look at. So you could look at this moon for as long as you want, and it's not going to hurt your eyes, even though it is sunlight that you're looking at. So that's exactly where we're going today. We're going to talk about the concept of Gevurah, because in Hashem's context, especially, but we'll see it in our context as well, but in Hashem's context especially, Gevurah is, in many senses, much more important than chesed. Now that might not sound logical to us. That's counterintuitive. The average person thinks the most important thing in life is chesed. Ask people. They'll always tell you this. Be kind. The most important thing is to be kind. Are you a kind person? That's misleading. Kindness is a variation of chesed, but it's misleading to believe that chesed is the most important attribute that a person could have, and certainly the most important attribute that Hashem could share with us. Why? Because misplaced chesed is unhealthy, and too much chesed is paralyzing, even if it's good chesed. And the reality is that chesed, very often, chesed actually precipitates a negative result, which is a strange thought. So if you're going to be very kind and very tolerant and very giving and very forgiving, forgiving might not be exactly chesed, but if you're going to constantly just, be there and available and hearing and sharing, etc., you're not necessarily doing people a favor. So it's going to emerge, as we look into what Gevurah is, it's going to emerge that in many respects, Gevurah is even more important than chesed. Thing is, what does Gevurah mean? Before we can even talk about whether it's more important, less important, whatever the case is, let's first just get a definition. So when we originally looked at the word chesed, everybody was quite comfortable to say that chesed means kindness. And then we unpacked it and we said, well, the reality is that kindness is a variation of chesed, but generally what chesed means is where a person moves away from their center of gravity and they start to share, give, or accommodate something that's outside of their comfort zone. So that's giving, it's tolerating, it's sharing, whether that be money, information, emotion, whatever the case is. All of those are chesed. So chesed is an extroversion. It's a movement of a person outside of their core towards. So when Hashem expresses chesed, what that means, Hashem's not giving us his essence. That's not possible. It's impossible to give your essence. But it means that Hashem is sharing, Hashem is revealing, Hashem is investing, Hashem is, so to speak, motivating. That's what chesed is. So if that's how we define chesed, how will we define Gevurah? First, we need a translation of the word Gevurah, and then we're going to need a definition of what Gevurah is, and immediately we're going to see, of course, like with chesed, it could be both positive and negative, but immediately we're going to see that actually there are two very different variations of what Gevurah is. So let's start first with the translation. How would you translate the word Gevurah? Strength. That is undoubtedly the most common translation. Just as chesed translates into kindness, Gevurah translates into strength, which is great. That's wonderful. But what is strength?
Discipline.
That's the question, right? Okay, so discipline is a form of strength. Restraint, which is in the same category as discipline, is a form of strength. How do you know that, by the way? Seeing as this originally was a Pirkei Avos class, so surely you should know this. How do we know that strength is restraint and discipline? Because in the 4th chapter of Pirkei Avos we learned, Ezehu Gibor HaKovesh HaSitzro. And what is the definition of somebody who's powerful? Is that they have the ability to curtail their own impulses, which means restraint and discipline. So there you have it. The definition of real strength is the strength we have over ourselves. Fine. What else? What else is strength besides discipline and restraint? What else would be a sign of strength? That's discipline and restraint. That's discipline and restraint. What else? What else fits into the title Gevurah? Strength. Bravery. So in today's world, we'll call a gibor a hero, right? So that implies that somebody who has Gevurah has courage. Okay. So maybe that's a little bit of a stretch. Let's keep it a little bit closer to the direct translation of strength. Strength and courage are not identical. Well, when somebody says strength, okay, let's leave all the philosophy out of it. When a person says strength, what do you think?
Power.
Power. That's what strength means. So now, if I say that this person is stronger than that person, I'm implying that they could lift a heavier weight, or they could do a harder exercise, or they could maybe they have this ability to run a marathon, which requires a lot of long-term strength. That's the most obvious association that we have with the word strength, is power. It's power. Now, well, it doesn't have to be physical. It can be mental power, could be resilience, could be endurance, but it's power. Okay, endurance we're going to see is not Gevurah. We'll get there when we get there. Gevurah, endurance is something else. But Gevurah implies power and it implies strength. For example, when we daven in the Amidah, what do we say? Ata gibor la'olam Hashem. What do we mean when we say that? What do we say? That you're disciplined. Hashem, you are disciplined. That's a little bit of a chutzpah, if we had to get up and make that kind of a comment. At face value, what we're saying is, you are powerful. In fact, what we mean is, you are all powerful. You are the most powerful. That's really what we mean. Ata gibor la'olam Hashem. You are the ultimate version of powerful. Here's another version of the word gibor or gevurah. Right? Very, very interesting, and it's going to be relevant to our conversation. This is really, really interesting. So the Mishnah in Tainus, so I don't know if you know this, but Tainus is the part of the Mishnah and then subsequently the Gemara that talks about the various fasts. I'm sure that you can pick that up in the name. But I don't know if people realize that Tainus starts, the very first conversation in Tainus is actually about rain. Because if it doesn't rain for a period of time, then you have to fast. Okay? So when it refers over there to rain, it calls it Gevurah geshamim. Gevurah geshamim. What does that mean? The strength of rain. So now I want to ask you, what does that mean? The strength of rain. Yesterday we had a few drops of rain. That wasn't considered the strength of rain, right? Surely. It was just like a little drizzle. What do you think of when you think of the power of rain? What do you think of? Think of a big thunderstorm, a classic Highfeld storm, right? That's what you think of, where there's noise and it comes down and it's pouring. As people say, it's raining cats and dogs or whatever. That's what you think of when you think Gevurah geshamim, the power of rain, which is true. And yet, at the same time, and the Gemara talks about this, where it says that if 2 drops of rain would come at the same time instead of individually, it would flood the world, because there's also the Gevurah of restraint. In the power of rain, even when it's literally pelting down, the fact is that Hashem's kindness to us is that rain falls in drops. In order to have those drops, that implies that there's some level of restraint. So in the imagery of rain, we've got the 2 sides of Gevurah. On the one hand, you've got the power of the rain, and on the other hand, you've got the restraint of the rain. So it's a very powerful rain on the whole, and it's a very restrained rain drop by drop. So both these concepts are happening simultaneously. You've got this paradoxical experience of rain. So in the same way, Gevurah is a paradoxical experience. So if I had to choose a name of Hashem to say, this is the name that represents Gevurah, which name do you think it would be? Because remember, the different names of Hashem represent different things, right? So which name of Hashem would be the name to represent Gevurah? Elokim. Or Elokeinu, right? Because what's Elokim? We always say that Elokim is Midas Hadin. It's the attribute of judgment or justice. Even though din is more judgment than justice, right? Tzedek is more justice. So Midas Hadin. What does that mean? What does it mean, Midas Hadin? The attribute of judgment. What's Hashem judging? The minute we hear that word, especially at this time of year, because we're going towards Yom Hadin. So naturally, when we think about judgment, we naturally think, I don't know if this is a safe space right now. If Hashem is judging, what if I don't stand up to his judgment? What if I haven't behaved in the way that I should, etc.? So we naturally have an association between judgment and being judged, which is valid. Now I want to ask you a question. Let's take it out of that context for a moment. Let's look at a different context. Let's say that you are running a business. And in the business, obviously, there are various people who have various roles. Who in the business leadership would you say has the chesed role? Think about this carefully. Who do you think in the business has the chief chesed role? So, in businesses, they've got all these fancy titles, CEO, CFO, CTO, CMO, right? So we're going to put up here, CCO, Chief Chesed Officer. So what would the role in a business be of the Chief Chesed Officer? So you're saying like HR? Okay, HR is not all so compassionate, right? Okay, the CEO possibly. So what do you call that? So I'm going to say that the person who is the chesed person in the business, in the organization, is the chief marketing officer. Because what is marketing? Taking yourself from your core and putting yourself out there into the public. Remember, that's the definition of chesed. The definition of chesed is that you go from your center of gravity and you reach out into an environment that is separate to you, maybe even foreign to you. And that's what marketing is. So in many respects, the chief marketing officer is the chief chesed officer of the whole organization. By the way, the CEO might very well have to have either the Bina has to understand how the business works and what the purpose of the business is, or the Chokhmah, the vision for the business, or the Keser, which is the motivation for why there should be a business in the first place. Okay, so who do you think, based on the information we have so far, we've just started our journey into Gevurah, which person on the leadership of, or in the leadership of the organization would be the chief Gevurah officer? CFO, that's obvious, right? So CFO, the chief financial officer, the accountant, the auditor, that is a classic chesed role, Gevurah role. So I want to ask you, when somebody brings something to the CFO and says, listen, can you allocate budget for this? What does the CFO have to do? What does he have to do? He has to investigate. In other words, he has to make a judgment. He has to make a judgment. Does this fit with the overall financial picture of the company? Can he see the value? So in other words, there you have Din and Gevurah working hand in hand. Din doesn't mean that I'm judging the person. Din means I'm judging the situation and I'm trying to work out objectively what is the best way to allocate these funds. That is what Gevurah is. Gevurah is deciding what is the best way to allocate the funds. In other words, you could even say that the CFO at the beginning of the year will play a somewhat chesed role, which is to say, this is our budget. That's what I'm giving. So the total budget for the business this year is $10 million. Now, when it comes to the decision of where we allocate that budget, that's when you have to have din. That's when you have to have Gevurah. Just because we've allocated X budget doesn't necessarily mean that it's available for every whim of every department. In fact, by the way, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but the statistics about people who win the lottery and how long it takes them to lose that money, they're quite scary. Everybody dreams about winning the lottery, right? But the reality is that the amount of people who win the lottery and then over a very rapid period of time lose that money, why is it? Because the lottery is a tremendous chesed moment in a person's life, not their own chesed, a chesed that happened to them. And because a person hasn't planned for it, therefore they don't have the Gevurah around this. So once they've got the money, they also go into chesed mode, which is, let's enjoy ourselves, let's go out, let's spend, let's buy things, let's have experiences. And although the person might in the back of their mind say, you've got to put some away for later, etc., whatever, but because they're not in a Gevurah mindset, so they're not wired in that context to have that kind of discipline, that's why the money can go. So din is not a bad thing. To the contrary, Gevurah is the security for chesed. If you don't have Gevurah, chesed's going to run out. Let's put that into human experience for a moment, because we can all relate to this. I was recently at a bar mitzvah where the father of the bar mitzvah said to the bar mitzvah boy, he had his 12 lessons for life. And one of the lessons was, no is a full sentence. No is a full sentence. Now, what's he trying to say? First of all, many of us battle with saying no, because we want to be chesed people. So somebody needs our help, we're going to help them. Somebody needs our time, we're going to give them time. Somebody needs a handout, we're going to give them a handout. Why? Because we want to be chesed people. The reality is, if we keep doing chesed, 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 eventually we deplete. And then there is nobody left to give that chesed. So no is a full sentence. No means I don't have to explain why no. I just have to realize for myself that sometimes no is the healthiest way to ensure the longevity of my chesed. The security of chesed is Gevurah. Or another version of the same story, I once heard that there was a child banging on his mother's bedroom door. The door was locked. He's banging on the door. There's a lot of chaos going outside. There were a few other kids. They were all young, running around, making a tumult. And this kid's banging and crying on the door and says, Mommy, what are you doing in there? And she says, I'm making you a mommy. Gevurah is the security for chesed. Without Gevurah, chesed runs either over or runs out. So now let's plug that back in. We said that the name of Hashem, which we're associating with Gevurah, is the name Elokim. Where do we first encounter the name Elokim? In creation. Not only in creation, but in the entire story of creation. The first time we encounter the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei is after creation is finished. And then the Torah says, "V'yoyim asoi savaya Elokim eretz v'shamayim." That's the first time that we encounter the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. But throughout the whole process of creation, it's Elokim, 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 Elokim. Why? Because the only way you could have a creation which is sustainable is with Gevurah. There has to be restraint, there has to be discipline, there has to be an allocation of the right amount of everything for each component of creation. I'll give you another fascinating perspective on this, right? So I was once, there was a guy talking to rabbis about how you're supposed to and when you're supposed to educate children about adult topics, around their own bodies and around molestation and around relationships and all that kind of thing. So this person said something which was absolutely fascinating. This person said that when you share mature information with a child who's not yet ready, they don't yet have the maturity or the exposure for that information, then that information itself is a form of abuse. So if a person does not have that Gevurah, doesn't know when and how to share, whether that's to share information, emotion, resources, when a person doesn't have that ability to calibrate, actually the chesed is destructive. So in the same way, if Hashem, for example, were to allocate, let's just say, if Hashem were to allocate to a spider the kind of energy that belongs in a human, that is cruel. It's going to overload the spider. It's literally like bringing your appliance that you bought in the United States, which is supposed to run on 110 volts, and you plug it into your South African plug over here, and kaboom, that's the end of it, because it's too much energy and it's not calibrated for this particular appliance. So throughout the whole process of creation, it's Elokim, 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 because what Hashem is doing is He's applying Gevurah at every single step of the way. Gevurah in that case means restraint. It means to withhold, because if Hashem doesn't restrain and He doesn't withhold, then the system cannot work. The system will be overwhelmed by godliness. It won't have the capacity for what we experience, which is independence. And if we don't have our independence, then we don't have the ability to actually be of any use. And we can't actually do what Hashem wants. So to put this into the language of Kabbalah, in Kabbalah we call this tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is that people often translate it as contraction, but there are variations of what tzimtzum means. Tzimtzum could mean to filter, tzimtzum could mean to downgrade, tzimtzum could mean to hide, and tzimtzum could mean to contract, which essentially means like a zip file. So these are multiple processes that Hashem uses in creation, and those Gevurah processes are critical for the creation to survive and for us to be relevant. To put it really simply. Have you ever worked with green screen technology? So in the old days, it was like a big deal. If you wanted to use green screen technology, you were probably in a professional studio, and it was like all done very fancy. In today's world, every cell phone can effectively now record with green screen technology, and you can make backgrounds and et cetera, et cetera. So essentially what green screen means is you put behind the person, you put a big sheet of either bright green or bright blue, and that allows them digitally to then, wherever that color is, replace it with a digital background. So you're standing, let's say for example, I'm standing over here in front of this, imagine this was a green screen, and then afterwards we superimpose onto the green screen that actually I'm standing at the White House or Lahavdil Kotel or something like that, and it's very compelling. Now the problem with green screen is this: if you rock up to the studio in the old days, because nowadays, like I say, everybody can do it off their phone, but in the old days you used to rock up to the studio, and if you didn't realize that they were using green screen technology and you had green somewhere on you, that part of you would disappear. Because that's how it works, right? You disappear into the background. And so you have these very funny videos that come up occasionally where a person's like missing an arm or whatever the case is because of the green screen technology. So green screen technology is the exact reverse of creation. In other words, in green screen technology, this is real, but now we create a virtual background that's not real. In creation, this is virtual. What we're living is virtual. And the only reason we can see it is because Hashem has put over us layers that are different to the color of his energy, if you can imagine it that way. So now, if Hashem would expose his energy, we'd all disappear, because then we wouldn't have the layer that distinguishes us from Hashem. So that's why Gevurah is so important. Without the Gevurah, we can't exist. We just disappear. And if you don't believe that that's possible, go back to what happened at Mount Sinai. There, Hashem didn't even expose himself completely. He just spoke. He just said the first two of the 10 Commandments. And that was so intense that we couldn't handle it. We couldn't remain individuals. We all disappeared, which the Midrash calls dying. But effectively what that means, we just disappear into the greatness of Hashem. So that's what would happen if it's just chesed without Gevurah. And if that sounds far-fetched, here's another way to understand it, a way that's really relatable to us. You ever hear the story of this couple who goes on a date? And he is one of those people who could speak endlessly about himself. I don't know if you've ever met people like this. So he's sitting over there through the date, and he's telling her about all his achievements and his accolades and his name dropping and who he's encountered and where he's been and what he's done, and on and on and on and on. She can't even get a word in edgeways. And eventually, after 45 minutes of this whole diatribe about himself, eventually he says, okay, I have said enough about me. Why don't you say something about me? That is a lack of Gevurah. That is totally toxic chesed. There's nothing kind about it, but chesed is a movement from myself into somebody else's or something else's space. And that's exactly what this person is doing. He's just in their space. And he's so much in their space that there is no room for relationship over here. In order to have a relationship, a person has to have Gevurah. Gevurah means that sometimes you have to be able to stop talking. Stop being in the space. Sometimes you have to allow the other. That takes restraint. That takes discipline. Now, the reason that human relationships are that way is because our relationships are a reflection of Hashem's relationship with his world. If Hashem had to put himself in our face all the time, not only would we not have an opportunity to speak, to perform, to achieve, we just simply wouldn't exist. So the core of all existence is Gevurah. Right? If Hashem did not hold back, if Hashem did not put up screens, if Hashem did not allow himself to be invisible, then we would not be able to exist. So what is the security of chesed? Hashem wants the world to exist. He wants to share with us. He wants to give us opportunities, which are all chesed things. What is the security of chesed? Gevurah. So again, chesed is the part that wants to give. Gevurah is the part that wants to judge what should be given. So directionally, chesed is the part of me that's moving outwards, that's about to share, that's about to give. Gevurah is the part of me that's holding back inwards so that it can balance and calibrate what I'm trying to share. Not to block what I'm trying to share, but to calibrate what I'm trying to share. That makes sense? So healthy Gevurah in a human being would look like respect. It would look like discipline. It would look like the ability to listen. Those are all elements of Gevurah. Unhealthy Gevurah would be a refusal to share. See the difference? A withholding of love. Or where a person is so judgmental that they actually justify the bad things that happen in other people's lives because they believe they're judge and jury of all people. That would be toxic Gevurah. Healthy Gevurah is one of the most valuable things that a person can have in their life. Self-discipline, restraint, appropriateness, modesty, they all fall into healthy Gevurah. But it's not that simple, right? Why is it not that simple? Because the other translation, which is also valid, is that Gevurah means power. And yes, we've said that it's self-power, the ability to constrain and restrain ourselves, because let's be honest, the most powerful adversary you'll ever face in your life is yourself. It's exactly perfectly calibrated to meet your strength. So you need all of your strength to be able to pull back against yourself. So obviously it's a lot of power that is required for self-restraint. However, when we hear the word power, that's not what we think. When we hear the word power, we think of the power to overcome, to achieve, to break through, to sometimes be victorious over. Right? That's usually what we associate with power. In other words, Power means the strength to get through obstacles, not only the strength to create personal obstacles. And by the way, here's a very good line to remember, which is self-restraint is never limiting. It's a very interesting line. I mean, I'm doing a kind of broad translation of the original. The original concept basically says, that's what it says. Self-restraint is not limiting. It's a very powerful thought. Effectively, what it means is self-restraint is empowering. But what we're talking about over here when we say Gevurah, sounds like it's not just about having the ability to restrain or contain myself, but the ability to also push through, the ability to get over negative things or to remove bad things from my life, etc. So how do we square off the idea of Gevurah as strength with the idea of Gevurah as restraint? And this is where it gets really fascinating. You ready for this? Here's where it gets really fascinating. And again, how we're going to see the value of Gevurah even over Chesed. So let's use a few different scenarios just to paint the picture, and it will help us understand what Gevurah means as strength and how the two interpretations of Gevurah are linked. They're not just two separate interpretations, they're directly linked to each other.
So can you just give me what you said about what's negative Gevurah? What's the toxic side?
So examples of negative Gevurah are refusal to share, tremendous criticism and judgment of others, the inability to be available. I didn't say that before, but that'd be an example of it. The inability to be available. Those are examples. And by the way, a very important example of toxic Gevurah is overwhelming self-criticism, because Gevurah is naturally introspective because it's judgmental, healthy judgment. But when it's toxic, then it's unhealthy judgment. So we always think of unhealthy judgment of others, but we forget that it could also be unhealthy judgment of ourselves. So let's just pause for one moment and identify who is the icon of healthy Gevurah in Torah. Yitzchak, right? Yitzchak. And who is the icon of unhealthy or toxic Gevurah in Torah? Esav. And it's really interesting because the Zohar uses the expression where it says that Esav's head is linked to Yitzchak's heel. Very interesting expression. Esav's head is linked to Yitzchak's heel. You'd think it's Yaakov, right? Because Yaakov has the heel connection. But the implication is that Esav, with all of his Gevurah, because it's so toxic, doesn't begin to scratch the surface of the value of Yitzchak's Gevurah. Now, how do you know that Yitzchak is a person of Gevurah? So everybody's going to obviously identify the fact that he was the willing sacrifice at the Akedah. That is the ultimate version of self-discipline, or more correctly, that is the ultimate version of being objective in self-judgment. Because that's the objectivity to say, it's not about what I want out of life, it's about what Hashem wants from me. And if this is what Hashem wants from me right now, then I'm going to go ahead and do it. And that's why you see in the Midrash that Yitzchak tells Avraham, make sure you bind me tightly so that I don't flinch, because I need to be there, present to do what Hashem wants. There's nothing, no personal agenda over here, no opportunity for, great ideology. It's just simply what Hashem wants. So that's a great example of where you see that Yitzchak is Gevurah. Where else do we see that Yitzchak is Gevurah in his story? That was the easy one, right? Okay, so where else in Yitzchak's story do we see symbols or symptoms of Gevurah?
Not in the brachos.
You could in the brachos, but we're not there yet. It's a good point.
After he gives the blessing to Yaakov, then there's the Gevurah there because he doesn't, or maybe you can't take it.
Okay, so there you could debate whether you can or can't take a bracha back, right? Okay, so that's a good question. So I think the brachos is a fascinating chapter. I don't know if we'll have the time for it, but it's definitely a fascinating chapter. So. No, not really. So I'm just going to jump straight into two very important examples. The one is intuitive, the one is not intuitive, and it's the second one that is relevant to what we're getting to, which is how Gevurah means power. So the part that is intuitive is Avraham, if you remember, traveled extensively through his life, and that included traveling outside of the borders of Israel. And a big part of what he did in his travels was to spread the word of Hashem wherever he went. That's what made Avraham so famous. Yitzchak, on the other hand, hardly traveled. Even in Israel itself, he does not travel nearly as extensively as Avraham does. And then he's not allowed to leave the borders of Israel. So even when there's a famine, he's only allowed to go to the land of the Plishtim, which is technically within the borders of Israel. In other words, Yitzchak's approach to life is that you don't go out there sharing God with everybody. You create a solid base that the seekers will come to if they want to find Hashem. So it's almost the exact opposite of Avraham, right? Which is fascinating. That he has this very restricted movement, because that's what Gevurah is. Gevurah is not moving from me outwards. It's actually waiting to bring the world to me. I'm going to have that discipline to see what belongs in my life, what doesn't belong in my life. So Yitzchak really matches that concept of Gevurah. But I'll tell you where you see the other side of Gevurah with Yitzchak, which is really interesting. If you had to imagine a chesed personality or a Gevurah personality, which of the two would you anticipate is more likely to be a wealthy person? A chesed person or a Gevurah person? You say Gevurah. Why do you say Gevurah?
Because they will monitor their money.
Okay, so they are less likely to lose the money they have. Correct. Okay, any reason you think that the chesed person is going to be more wealthy?
I don't know, maybe you give a lot of tzedakah.
Okay, so they'll give a lot of tzedakah, and Hashem will 10x that tzedakah, and you'll get a lot back. But there's another very practical element to it, and that is that a chesed person is going to put themselves out there. And the reality is, in order to accumulate wealth, a person has to be willing to step out into the world and to engage with people and to network and to do things that are a little bit outside of the comfort zone, which is more likely for the chesed person. And yet, the Torah makes it clear that Yitzchak was considerably wealthier than Avraham. How do we know that? Because the Torah tells us that Yitzchak ba'aretz ahi, that Yitzchak went and he planted, and the Torah says ba'aretz ahi, it was a very difficult time in a very difficult arid land, and yet vayimtza ba'aretz ahi mea she'arim, he got 100-fold of the harvest that any person was supposed to get. And that becomes a symbol and an icon of the fact that Yitzchak actually generated considerably greater wealth even more than Avram did, which is quite fascinating. Why? Because he has the power of Gevurah. You see, when Gevurah is in restraint mode, then it's just going to play safe. And it's just going to ensure that we don't lose what we have. But when Gevurah is in power mode, then Gevurah is going to go out there and conquer the world and actually become this really, really in this case, wealthy individual. And in other contexts, it could become power in other ways. That's why, for example, the toxic version of Gevurah in Esav's context is all about conquest and colonialism and eventually capitalism, which are all very Gevurah-based attitudes and not necessarily healthy Gevurah-based attitudes. So, where did Avram get his wealth from? Various places. One of the things was when... right, exactly. So I'm saying for somebody who's very difficult situations in life that produce wealth, Yitzchak worked for his wealth. By the way, I just want to mention one other thing that's very famous about Yitzchak is that Yitzchak spent a lot of time digging wells, and it becomes a big feature in his life. And a well is supposed to represent Gevurah. Why? Because you've got to break through all of the barriers to find the resource, as opposed to chesed, which is comparable to like flowing rivers and springs, which are just naturally available to us. Okay? So anyhow, so coming back, so what's the point about strength and Gevurah? So this is really beautiful when you think about it. The chesed person can be totally focused on themselves. And we spoke about this a little bit last week, that the chesed person wants to give to the beggar on the side of the road so that they'll feel better. The Gevurah person, who is more objective and more disciplined, so the Gevurah person is actually going to be interested in the value of somebody else, not in the giving to somebody else. You see the difference? The chesed person sees the value in the giving, whereas the Gevurah person, who's judging and objectively identifying people, is going to find the value in somebody else. Remember, they're judging, not being judgmental. Big difference. In other words, it's honest and it's objective and it's finding the value in every single person. When I find the value in somebody, am I going to be motivated to then reach out to them? Of course I will, because I see their value. In fact, when I see the value in somebody, I'll be more motivated to reach out and invest meaningfully with them than if I was just being a chesed person. This is subtle, but it's very powerful. The chesed person doesn't get engaged in the reality of the other person's experience. The chesed person is, I'm a chesed person. I'm doing the Oprah Winfrey thing, everybody's getting one, here you go. You can have a gift and you can have a gift or whatever. That's like the chesed mentality. Whereas the Gevurah mentality says we're going to do some kind of an audit over here, which includes identifying potential. Because if you do it properly, if you do a true analysis, you're going to see potential. If you're going to see potential, you're going to want to invest in that potential. In order to invest in that potential, that's going to take a lot of strength. It's going to take a lot of strength because the easy pickings are good for the chesed people. But if you want to invest in somebody, that's going to take a lot of strength. And if you're going to want to take a lot of strength, you're also going to have to be very disciplined in your approach. It's going to have to make sense what your approach is. A person can't willy-nilly just go invest and hope that that investment is going to show returns. It's the same with people. If you're going to invest in somebody, you can't just say, okay, I think you're a great person, or like they write on the school reports, your child has a lot of potential. Great. Thanks very much. You don't have to tell me that. I knew that. That's why I sent him to school. Your job is to discover and nurture that potential. That's why I sent him to school, right? So Gevurah is going to be, and here's where you see the metaphor of rain. Rain cultivates. Rain allows things to grow. Rain can get to places rivers don't get to. And by the way, a river is a symbol of chesed because a river just flows. It just goes from the source down to the sea, and along the way, whoever's along the way is given water, and that's wonderful, and it's kind of easy. Whereas rain gets into all the nooks and crannies, places that people did not necessarily anticipate could be irrigated. Why? Because the goal of rain is that power to say, I want to get into every place and share value and brocha and nurture in every place. In order to get there, I can only go one drop at a time. That's the paradoxical nature of Gevurah. On the one hand, it's so powerful, and the power means I could reach further, because that's what power is. I can go further, dig deeper, reach higher. All of those things are Gevurah elements. How? Because I'm going to find the drop that goes there and the drop that goes there, the channel that speaks to this person and the channel that speaks to that person. It's not just one big chesed, happy family, we're just going to spread light wherever we go. This is focused, this is disciplined, this is bespoke, this is calibrated for each recipient, and therefore Gevurah actually has the ability to create far greater wealth than chesed. Let's plug that into creation. Had Hashem created the world with just chesed, this is alluded to in the first chapter, in the first Mishnah of chapter 5 of Pirkei Avos. If Hashem had wanted to create a world out of just kindness, he would have just said, let there be existence. And then it would have been this one generic kind of energy that just flowed all over the world, and that's how everything would exist. Instead, he decided to create the world with multiple statements, meaning, I'm going to give this energy to that part of the world, that energy to that part of the world. That will empower, there's the word Gevurah again, empower each part of the world to reach its greatness and its potential. So what do we see? Not only is Gevurah the security of chesed, but we see that Gevurah actually takes the energy and the well-intentioned energy of chesed way further than chesed alone could. That's a great lesson in life, because we are very easily caught up in the need for chesed, and you've got to be kind, which is true. But when a person has Gevurah, which takes a lot more work, a lot more discipline, a lot more focus, the results are going to be far greater. Last point for today, and that is, if you had a look at the columns, you saw that Gevurah is a direct continuum from Bina. What's the difference between Chokhmah and Bina? Well, there are many, but one of the differences is that Chokhmah is the original generic idea, and Bina is the analysis of the detail within that idea. And therefore, Chokhmah will produce a chesed response, which is a generic response of giving and sharing. Whereas Bina, once I've really given this thought and I've really analyzed and I've really tried to understand, that will result in a Gevurah response, which says, let's give what is appropriate in each context. Now, each one has a value, but as you can see, chesed without Gevurah is not a very healthy place to be. It's almost impossible to have Gevurah without chesed in a healthy way. Gevurah without chesed is usually just toxic, but Gevurah will build chesed into something which is absolutely magnificent. And it could be cruel, yes, exactly.
And what about tough love?
So that is tough love. Tough love is Gevurah applied to chesed. Yep, that's true. That is true.